This week's discussion module is going to focus primarily on propaganda. If you're following along in our graphic design history, a critical guide book by Joanna Drucker and Emily McVarish, much of this content is going to be included in Chapter 11. However, some of the earlier pre-World War II propaganda will be sprinkled in through some of the more recent previous chapters. So when we think about propaganda, many of us might think of political propaganda, but the definition, according to Merriam-Webster, number 2 and number 3, I think, are most interesting. Basically, the propaganda is the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. So if you notice that there's two ways of looking at this, propaganda doesn't always have to be bad, meaning injuring. It can also be a positive message in order to communicate, right? So ideas, facts, or allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage an opposing cause. It's also a public action having that effect. So this presentation is going to include images that are historical, have been out there in the public domain, but some of you may find these to be offensive in the visual imagery, the words that are used, or the overall message of the graphic design artifact. I just want you to be aware of that because we're looking at this from a historical perspective to learn. There are going to be some contemporary or post-2000 references. However, we're using those as a context to understand some of the historical aspects. I like to use this term citizen designer when I'm talking about propaganda because this is a newer term from the postmodern era of the 90s, where a lot of designers are utilizing an oppositional message to make statements about things like consumerism, capitalism, or war. So we've seen designers and creative people get involved in this aspect of utilizing the visual techniques to send a message in some capacity. Citizen designer can also be related to terms that we use now, like environmental justice, social justice, and those kind of movements, all right? I like to also think about this as a time travel log because we're putting ourselves back in time. Again, it's looking at imagery that we might today consider offensive. Now, the most recent public health phenomenon that we have encountered as a global society was the pandemic. So I'm using the pandemic just to kind of as a segue into some of the public health examples that we'll be looking at first. So on the right-hand side here, we have an example of a historical poster from the 50s and 60s. So propaganda in this case is being utilized to spread a message to help the general public. In this case, it is issued by the Ministry of Health. So oftentimes if you're looking at these documents, you can see where the source is and who is sending the message if it is a public service. Sometimes like 1970, you can also see evidence of the illustrator or someone who was involved in creating the poster. So the initials or the last name are oftentimes signed. This text is a little bit too small for us to read right now, and is not necessarily relevant in our study at the moment, but just know that if you take a deeper dive into this type of design artifact, I'm going to show you some examples of where to find them in a few minutes. But let's compare the difference here. So what we're seeing is the utilization of kind of like a cuteness, right? The animal is trying to send this message. There aren't any humans being used in these two pieces, even though we're talking about human people. Coughs and sneezes, spread diseases, trap the germs. So this is a visual metaphor by thinking about birds and the handkerchief substituting for something that we're trapping, right, in your handkerchief. And for COVID, the message was to wash your hands and so forth, okay? Now, this is a set by a graphic designer named Scott Suiuchi, and you can see that there is a really interesting element here that all of these are consistent in their composition, the typography, and the use of illustration. The structure of this with the visual hierarchy of the message at the top and an illustration to kind of coincide with that, and then the message below. There was actually, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, an artist campaign during COVID. This website, Erase COVID, has a collection of these artifacts that were contributed by a variety of designers and illustrators. For example, here's Scott's that I just showed you the posters, and Michael Bushmiller, Tiki Tony, and so on and so forth. You're welcome to go and look at this collection and learn a little bit more about the movement. So we are going to see some examples of how designers and illustrators were active and sometimes employed by the government of whatever country to help visually communicate about these certain issues. So this is an example of propaganda being utilized to help promote a public health awareness. And this Erase COVID is actually a movement of artists coming together. It was not a top-down approach of kind of a entity saying, hey, please designers do this so that we can promote it. It was a collective ground up of artists and designers wanting to be involved in utilizing their skills in this way to kind of build awareness of the social health issues. I'm having a little issue with my mouse here, so let's just, hopefully I can click through the, let me just see here. Okay, so historically, these are some examples from the early 20th century. Now, it might seem silly to us right now to see a poster about how to bathe, or that, we should be sleeping in the fresh air or something like that. But I encourage you to pause this video at any time to read more of the details. But in this case, I'll just kind of go through, right? How to bathe, steps 1, 2, and 3. But then if we look at the details here, a pleasant reaction, a sensation of warmth, and a feeling of general well-being should always follow the bath. So you can imagine that at the turn of the century, we've talked about the Industrial Revolution, and we've been looking at movements such as the Victorian, arts and crafts, which is a rejection of the industrialization, and then Art Nouveau, that is embracing the Industrial Revolution. But you have a society that is shifting from agricultural to urban. And in that regard, you're also having a society shifting from not having public water systems, or in some cases water inside the house, right? So you're moving from like either public baths or outhouses or, things like that into a more dense population. So these were posters that were utilized as propaganda to just try and help communicate to the general public about just kind of like social norms, basically. Here's an example. Turn in at a regular hour. Men need 8 or more hours to sleep. Boys need more. Why it's only a boy focus, we can talk about that at another time. This example, building for the community. The spirit of the true family must become the spirit of the community. Women are largely the makers of the home and the conservators of its spirit. Will your home be merely a place for eating and sleeping, or will it be a home of understanding, comradeship, of family spirit, and of neighborliness? Now, if we look super close at the detail, this poster is 1923, the American Social Hygiene Association. Why would a social hygiene organization want to be talking about home ownership and building a home? Okay, so that's one thing that I'd like you to think about. The second thing I'd like you to think about is the illustration versus photographs. So when we learned about photography a few weeks ago, photography was the moment in time where we as humans are seeing visual representation of actual reality. So when photographs are being used at the early turn of the century in design, most often they're being shown as the reality or the assumption of the reality. Illustration, on the other hand, is really an interpretation. It's actually an idealization of that. So when photography was first introduced in the Civil War or wars before that, you might have an illustrator or a journalist embedded with the troops, and the illustrator is drawing an interpretation or painting an interpretation of what they're seeing, and maybe creating a idealized version of that, or a less graphic and less traumatic visual example of what they're seeing versus a photograph that is showing the reality. Now, in this presentation, we're going to look at how that can now, and with the tools of photography, be utilized to manipulate within the aspects of the propaganda. Now, if we are trying to promote a society that is based around homeownership, there are a lot of other kind of stakeholders involved in that. Here's another example of a social hygiene poster, and I'm going to show you why social hygiene might have been the purpose of these in a moment. But this one on the left, I'd like you to just pause for a second. Now, this is a Rockwell-esque illustration, which was kind of popular at the time. We notice a child building a house. We might notice the blueprints that the husband and wife are looking at, right? So kind of promoting this like nuclear family and the home ownership. And this is really kind of the beginnings of this idea of single family homes in the United States and how important that is in kind of like a propaganda message. So it says, build your home upon partnership, partners fit and congenial, radiate happiness, maintain personal health, transmit their fitness for a finer race. Another questionable term, share joys, sorrows, and responsibilities in the spirit of mutual love. Okay, now this one, beauty comes from within. Paint your cheeks from the inside out, outdoor exercise. So this kind of correlates to keeping the windows open. So this is about like health benefits, but in today's society, we could say that this is sexist, right? Most girls could be prettier than they are because most girls could be healthier. Well, some of the reasons for this kind of government use of propaganda has to do with kind of the social hygiene association. So, with the advent of more contemporary society, and when we looked at Art Nouveau, kind of the opening up of like um, economics and a burgeoning middle class and a burgeoning upper class, a more leisure time. And in the Art Nouveau, we see more people, like fashion is changing, right? We saw that you're able to show your ankles, for example. And along with this becomes transmutable diseases. So it becomes a concern from a social health perspective, and that is where the Social Hygiene Association gets involved. So this website is going to give you a bunch of links so that you can look at a lot of these different posters. And a lot of this was propaganda to, here's for boys, here's for girls, to try and kind of, control society in its kind of social habits, right? Social hygiene, and then here's like against prostitution, blah 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 blah. So this website is just a social history welfare project or history project that is on the Virginia Commonwealth website. When you go in to look at some of the gallery items, there's a lot of different ways of investigating this. You can browse by historical materials, you can look at the discovery sets, and so on, okay? Now, this is the National Library of Medicine, and we can see that they actually acquired a collection of posters relating to public health and viruses, and even, for example, in the 80s. So we're jumping around in time a little bit here as I'm showing you some of these collections. But I just want you to be aware that there are a lot of sources out there that have these archived. Okay, so the 80s was kind of HIV/AIDS issues, but we can see by looking at some of the collections of more historical aspects of how these organizations sometimes top down, as opposed to the COVID example that I showed you at the beginning, are propaganda to the social society. Now, this example is kind of the beginnings of this movement towards home ownership. The owned home makes life more worthwhile in every way. The homeowner, right? This is what we might consider the American dream, growing up and owning your own single family home. Well, this is from 1922. The National Association of Real Estate Boards created this marketing campaign as propaganda to promote homeownership. Well, if you think about real estate and who benefits from that, there are a lot of other stakeholders involved in that aspect, right? So creating this marketing and propaganda about the benefits of the home ownership. And just so you can understand where this is coming from, let me see if I can find my... This is called JSTOR, and you can sort this. You can use keywords to do an advanced search, and then you can also click on some of their hyperlinks. So this is an example here of this image, okay? Own your own home. It's part of a visual arts legacy collection. And when we click on the image, let's see here. Okay, there's 200,000 items. So we're not going to dig through that right now. But what I'd like you to understand is that there's lots of resources for us to see many of these different examples that are also related to propaganda that you might not expect. Okay, so propaganda about social health or owning real estate or, different aspects of society. So we can see that there are even ways now that we can actually purchase posters. So there's a collection of directories out there. Now this Vintograph has all sorts of things like vintage travel posters, World War II posters, World War I posters, park posters, blah, 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 right? And this is just the health and safety posters because that's what I'm talking about at the moment. Here are 40, let me just go to this is going back in time. So 40s, and looking at the difference of what the content is as well as the design aspects of them. So here, just in this little blurb, starting in the 1930s, public health posters promoting the prevention and early detection of STDs became widespread. So campaigns sought to achieve early detection in part by downplaying the shame of contracting the disease. Part of that is the use of these illustrations. Okay, passage of the disease from mother to child was very common, making it vital to educate the public on the risk it posed to children, as well as the fact that a cure had been found in penicillin. Okay, so the advent of healthcare and science coinciding with some of these social health things caused by population increase and the social times and the increase in like an urban environment. This is a really nice archive as well. This is from the UK National Archives. You can see this is chronological as I'm going to scroll down. So tuberculosis awareness. Here's a film. Ministry of Health encouraging blood donation. This is 1949, so kind of like post-World War II. Helping to explain these things to the general public. 1962, please, cover your trash, right? Smoking because of an issue, the AIDS epidemic, and then down here at the bottom, you can click on exploring the health and welfare collection and then a post-World War II. I'm going to provide the links for these, but you can also read them at the top. Here are the 1930s, again, the tuberculosis. So there's so many articles, there are so many collections of just super interesting visual examples of graphic design, typography, and illustration in kind of a theme that you might not expect in these propaganda, social health, and welfare. Now, the Library of Congress is actually a really important entity for the United States, and they have they collect almost every single book that's been printed. So the Library of Congress is another resource if you're looking for interesting examples beyond doing just a Google search, because a Google search is just going to aggregate the most often clicked on imagery. All right, so when we look historically, the Russian constructivists wanted to take to the street. So they were kind of rejecting, and the avant-garde of the 1920s and 30s was rejecting these systems of like museums and libraries, and they wanted to utilize the street as a place to communicate information. Now, when we say street, we just mean in the public domain. So I'm going to show you an example here of something that's mailed, and then we're going to jump back into a Soviet example. So in this case, I'm blocking out an image that is very shocking to people. Now, this is a postcard, okay? So let's look at the poem on the postcard first. If you feel like you don't want to look at this, you can fast forward through this or what have you. But this is a real artifact. The photograph is from 1908. The poem reads, "The dogwood tree. This is only the branch of a dogwood tree, an emblem of white supremacy." They're using rhyming. A lesson once taught in pioneer school that this is a land of white man's rule. We can ascertain that this is a very shocking imagery, but it is propaganda that is being communicated in the form of a postcard within a certain community. They're talking about white supremacy. Now I'm going to click on this, and you, like I said, you can fast forward through it. It is something that you might even see in movies now, but this is a reality of a scene. Let's look at how public transportation and trains were also being utilized for sending public propaganda messages. Now, the Agit train has a history that you can look up and find articles about, and I'm going to show you a couple of these. Now, as trains were becoming expanded, like railroad lines were becoming expanded, the Soviets were utilizing trains to reach very remote rural areas. And the Agit trains were created to have murals on them. Pause here for a second. So this is an article about the Soviet Agit trains. It's a collection from the Austrian Film Museum, and this article goes into more detail about the intention, the history. Agitational bureaus were established at major railroad stations where libraries, lecture halls, and theaters were open, and sometimes they were also included inside of these trains. Now you can see that they're using murals and public, kind of like a public space to create their propaganda messages, and within those murals it is illustrations that are being used. So this article goes into more detail about that, but I've also found, I'm not going to show the whole thing here, but this person...
Assalamu alaikum, comrades. Today we're going to be talking about Agit trains, literal propaganda trains. There were 5 main Agit trains named for the regions that they primarily serviced. Those trains being the Krasny Kozak, the Red Cossack, the Krasny Vostok, the Red East, the Sovetsky Kavkaz, the Soviet Caucasus, the October Revolution, and the Lenin. Launched in 1918 and running throughout the 20s and then relaunched again during World War II, Agit trains were literal propaganda trains used to reach further across the large landscape of the Soviet Union. With land as large as the Soviet Union, trains became an incredibly important thing even for the average person, something out of the average man's reach to use previously, and not as developed as it came to be in the Soviet Union. For the first time, many people moving to larger cities because it's accessible. So putting propaganda on trains made sense. They were brightly painted by the likes of famous propagandists like L. Lazinski, and inside of them were many things. Of course, propaganda to be distributed across the Soviet Union, its own printing press, theaters, public speakers, and of course, all of the literature came in many different languages. A lot of the literacy efforts were heavy in places like Central Asia, who, if they could read, often read in Arabic script for Turkic languages. So the efforts were massive, and the propaganda became localized for issues prominent in the areas they were traveling to. But it was widely successful. Within the first year, over 430 free screenings of silent movies were shown across the Soviet Union. Their tactics varied because there were various levels of literacy in the country, and having these sorts of films and easier to understand books within a library within these traveling trains helped the population immensely. And there were many tactics to make literature and information accessible to everyone, not just the Agit train or Rosta windows postering newspaper.
Okay, so I'm not going to show the last few seconds of this, but this kind of explains how the public space was being utilized as well. And this article here from Apparatus is a longer, more academic article about the Agit trains. So if this interests you, I would definitely take a deep dive into learning a little bit more about the motivation and kind of the methods that were being utilized in the Soviet era. Now, this example is also from like the JSTOR. You can see that even fabric and textiles are being used as containing symbols, and this is kind of the people's revolution, you know, the everyday person being represented. Now let's talk a little bit more about photography, and I'm going to switch between this image that was shown and the original. Okay, so I want you to see if you can notice the differences between the two. Okay, and at any time I encourage you to pause here to take a look at these two images. Okay, so we can see that this is manipulated. This one is the original and this one is the modified. Okay, so some of the obvious things about the photograph is just kind of darkening elements. So this is pre-Photoshop, so this would have had to have been done in a darkroom. And these are some techniques that you can do with a negative and you know, kind of dodging, what's called dodging and burning. You can adjust the imagery. Now this would have been handwritten and overlaid onto the photograph. Well, what does that say? It says, struggle for your rights, down with the monarchy, long live the republic. So we can see the photography was starting to be used as a tool for manipulating imagery long before Photoshop and artificial intelligence that we have, that we're experiencing in today's world. Okay, so you can see that photography, especially in the Russian constructivists and the early 20th century, they were utilizing the darkroom to change imagery. So you can see here that this is Lenin making a speech and the original image and the manipulated image. Let's take a look at that from the JSTOR. So you can see that you can go into JSTOR and search for some of these things, and I would try using the falsified image description so that you can find more examples of these if this interests you. So this is a retouched photograph in 1924. The top picture was created by replacing the crowd from the original photograph with the one that was taken at the bottom. So you can see that this is a method of propaganda and manipulating the imagery by utilizing photography. Now, when I talked about photography at the beginning of this presentation versus illustration, our brain has a hard time deciphering the reality, right? So photography, the brain interprets this as real. As mentioned, when photography was first kind of introduced to the world and seeing things like the Civil War and photographs of reality versus an illustrator. So photographs are being utilized in this way to kind of, you know, as a manipulation tool because of the brain's interpretation of it, right? So it's how does an individual know that they're being shown falsified images? So when you click in JSTOR on just the falsified image collection and their keyword, these are going to be examples of the most recent that they have here. Okay. However, what I'd like to do is jump back to an example from 2012, and this is the Romney campaign. This is Mitt Romney's Instagram, and here's a collection here of some images and some of the comments that were being made on Instagram. Now, this is like when social media was just being established, and the tools that we are looking at from 1984 and the Macintosh and postmodernism are now even more, as you know, more widely available to people. Okay, so I'm only showing post-2000 material just as context of how early manipulation of photography is influencing a more contemporary component, especially in the terms of how propaganda is being used. So here you have Mitt Romney posting America's Comeback Team 2012, and then people are commenting about if you have to Photoshop your campaign pics, something's wrong, right? Crappy Photoshop, blah, 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 blah. So if you did a little research at the time, you would find this post proving that this image was manipulated and actually done in a poor way, right? So the roof sections are not being lined up. This is definitely before the advances that we're seeing now, where you can literally just press a button and it's going to be created for you, right? So trees and people are duplicated, the crowd is duplicated, sign duplicated, the Ramanin, that was like the big thing, the Ramanini, right? So up here, Ramanini's. Here's another photographic example of a missile launch in I can't remember when this was, so forgive me. I'm not going to say the country, but this was like the lead picture that was released of this missile test launch, and the media was actually able to find the original picture. So you can see that this was a basically Photoshop, rubber stamp, and duplicating the images to make it look like there are more missiles being fired than there were. Well, 4 versus 3, okay? And also in 2013, there was an example of an Iranian news site manipulating the photograph of Michelle Obama to cover her arms and her neck. So these tools can be used in very subtle ways that the everyday person who's receiving these images may not realize that it's happened, okay? Because we're not going to get into like the psychology of this, but in general, we know that we're bombarded in today's society by hundreds of thousands of images. So when we go back in time, we can imagine how impactful this would be as society was becoming a visual culture. So this is an example of the Russian constructivists' early collage and photo montage. This is by, as you might recall, Stepanova. Okay, and then this new typography movement of utilizing sans serif and the asymmetrical, kind of turning things on a 45-degree angle. But we also looked a few weeks ago at Russian constructivism and just kind of the use of symbols and simple geometry even. Now, when we look at historically at some of the posters that are more well known to us, we see an idealized image by using illustration. So this "I want you" is very well known, and this is where the notorious Uncle Sam, this kind of image of a character, it becomes. So we have the use of the flag and the finger pointing directly at you. Okay, this is being utilized in England as well. We want you to join the army. Okay, so there's this movement to get people to be included and on that patriotic side of their country. So this illustration is representational and a rhetorical substitution of the terms really for patriotism. Okay, I need you in the Navy. Our country will always be proudest of those who answered the first call. And we can see in these examples that women are being used in the illustrations in the American flag as this tool of being patriotic, but women not being in the military at this time, the target is really about either saving food or saving resources or helping the military effort in a different way, like the nurses joining this case is the Australian Red Cross. You can see that this is by the U.S. Food Administration. But let's look at another example of how the flag is being utilized in some of these propaganda posters and advertisements. So you have this one over here on the left, Wake Up America, right? Like the sleeping Lady Liberty. So the way that the flag is being utilized as her dress is intended to represent a rhetorical device. Now, on the other hand, here's an example of a real woman, a photograph of a real woman who is working in the manufacturing of creating the bombs, right? So in order to fund the war, they wanted people to buy victory bonds, which would help them spend the money to build the ammunitions. Okay, and in contrast to that, USA bonds, this one is about something similar to trying to get people to purchase these bonds so that there is like this movement of patriotism to be active in the war effort. But this one is using a little bit more heroic realism. You can see that the flag is being used. There's kind of a gender neutrality here, but this kind of heroic realism with the Boy Scout holding a sword that is too heavy for the child, and how this is being kind of glorified, right? And then in contrast over here on the left, we're kind of tugging at the heartstrings, right? With an illustration of a child. I'm not going to get into the color of the skin or the color of the hair, the color of the eyes, but you know, you could dig into that if you want. My daddy bought me a war loan bond. Did yours? Now, children can't buy bonds, but this is another propaganda technique, right? And if you notice many of these, the eye contact is also very important. Look at the eye contact. You are not looking at a real person. You're looking at an illustration of a person with this eye contact directly at you, kind of tugging at your heartstrings. Now, this is a very famous poster, Rosie the Riveter, who is representational of the women who were asked to go into the workforce. So World War II, most of the men had to leave to fight in the war, and there was no one left behind to do the work in the manufacturing of the ammunitions, as we see in this example with the picture of the woman. So Rosie the Riveter becomes a idealized version of this kind of American patriotism, that we all can do it together. You can see that there is a reference to a flag here with the colors, and then this kind of heroic realism with kind of showing the muscles, right? And then again, notice who is creating these. So this is War Production Co-Coordinating Committee. So who is creating the message, basically? All right, so some of the next few images that I'm going to show you are included in that kind of warning that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, that you are going to see some images that might be offensive and some language that is definitely considered racist or offensive to people, okay? But I'm going to show these to you as historical representations of what was happening at the time. So this example on the left, destroy this mad brute. I would like you to see if you can notice, can you read what's on the club? Can you read what's on the ground? And then this is by the U.S. Navy. I think it is U.S. Navy, U.S. Army. And then an enlist enlist in the U.S. Army. I think this might be a address. Okay, so in the background you see something that's like completely destroyed, and you have this representation of this of an animal that is seen as ferocious, and then in the top it says militarism. If we were in a classroom together, I would invite you to pair up or team up with people that were around you so that you could discuss this image together and kind of pick it apart. I invite you to do that if you know anyone who is also studying this at the same time. Okay, now who is this? This could be Lady Liberty, right? With the flowing hair. We saw this flowing hair in the Art Nouveau movement. Now, in contrast, you see some of the Russian propaganda of like the People's Movement. And this was very common, utilizing photographs of machines and commoners and the way that they are kind of portrayed heroically within the composition. So this is 1939. Now, in 2008, the Vogue created this cover, and there was a gigantic controversy regarding this cover. So I invite you to pause for a moment and see if you can notice the similarities. And again, I used to teach this class in person as a full-time graphic design professor, and we would spend some time together in the class kind of talking about this image and comparing it. So I don't want to lessen the value of the conversation by the fact that this is merely me presenting information to you. Okay, but there is similarities in this, right? And this kind of like mad brute representation holding the beautiful white girl. Let's look at some of the articles that came out around this time. Okay, so on the Today Show, you can see by the date of this that this is March 2008. Stirs up controversy, right? So LeBron was the first black man to be on the cover of Vogue, and I think this was an Annie Leibovitz photograph, and this is kind of like the response of their message, right? I invite you to read this article. This article shows the cover alongside this poster. Okay, so let's just look at this. The brute caricature is arguably the most deadly caricature on this list, depicting black men as violent and hypersexual rapists of white women. This caricature was used as a way to villainize black men during the height of the abolitionist movement and Reconstruction era. In the present day, the brute caricature still makes a massive impact. In 2008, Vogue was under hot water when accused of photographing a professional basketball player with the model, suspiciously similar way to a World War I poster in 1917. The poster depicts Germany as a wild gorilla holding a club and a white woman. The caption above the image reads, "Destroy this mad brute." James is holding the white woman, who is wearing a similar dress to the woman in the poster, in one hand while dribbling a basketball in the other hand in place of the club. Depicting black people as apes is a common caricature meant to humiliate and to humanize them. I invite you to read the rest of this article. Okay, so here's a little bit better tone of the poster that I'm showing. But you can see that this was for U.S. Army, and it was 1917, and this relationship between these two things. Okay. Now, when we look at some of the other language that is being utilized in war propaganda, you're going to see racist words being used. Okay. Now, there's also visual rhetoric being used. So in this case, the metaphor of the mouse trap, keep your mouth shut. Crews claim J-boat knew of ships sink sailing. Okay. Don't give the rats any information. And how illustration is being used to kind of create these cartoony versions of the enemies. Illustrations. I'll not comment on these except to invite you to look in more detail at them. Okay. Using rhyming and illustrations to create these visual messages. The blabotage, as well as utilizing these images on covers of magazines, for example. Okay. More illustrations, more visual representations of the quote-unquote enemies of the U.S. Rhetoric devices, metaphors, don't crow like a rooster. It's an easy way to lose the war. And then this was a common theme that you'll also see in a lot of this in the propaganda for the war, like don't talk. Someone talk, someone listen, someone acted, ship was sunk, don't gossip. So this is a common theme as well. Now, notice the difference. This one is using photographs with just a little bit of color being added. Okay, so like the real thing, like almost like a movie, correlating these ideas together of a social setting where someone is listening in on the conversation and then something happening with the Navy. Okay. Loose lips might sink ships. That's a phrase that we hear even now. Okay. And then the promotion of creating a manufacturing. Now, what's fascinating about these is that this goes beyond just like recruitment to and buying bonds to actually like sustainability issues. So because there were limits and rations, right? So it's like, saving your food, saving the waste fat, like everything was like all of the activities of like everyday life are like included into the war effort. And then also just, I think this one's an interesting thing, like a wonderful opportunity to travel is a way to recruit people into the Navy during the war, which seems very ironic. Let's look at some archival places that you can find even on your travels. So the Imperial War Museum in London is a very good museum. They have a visual gallery, but they also have these incredible museums that you can visit. And I would encourage you to go through, if you ever are in any of these places, to see the artifacts on display. And a lot of information about the war document that they have and just kind of like a, understanding of the war. Here's an example of a vintage poster of health, right? So the public health kind of getting like overlapping the war effort. U.S. needs us strong, eat the basic 7 every day. So communication with people, trying to, let's see, with over 12 million Americans, 11% of the total population serving in the armed forces, everything from food to labor was tight on the home front. It became incredibly important to ensure that America's public was that was left at home stayed healthy and in order to contribute to the war effort. This poster from that time period demonstrates the 7 food groups that were considered part of a healthy diet. Okay, let's see a few other examples that I have for you. This is a great posters of the Great War. So articles and collections of a lot more of these. This is the food. So lots of food posters. Lots of be patriotic, right? Food posters, really cool stuff. Here, right? Miscellaneous food and drink posters. So I invite you to go through and look at some of these examples. They have some more online exhibits as well. This one is the working nurse. So depictions of nurses shaped sentiments towards the war. Here again, you can see the Lady Liberty, similar to the American or the Australian Red Cross that I was showing earlier. The recruitment of nurses, spreading awareness, right? So that's a really great article and gallery. And then we're going to talk about this in a second. Okay. These examples are a collection, obviously not of all the same time period, but you can see some similarities in how the human form, the human male figure is being shown, mostly in illustrations. This advertisement here is a photograph, but the way that the angle of it is kind of showing, you know, similarities of like this idealized masculine man, the Roman gladiator, and how this kind of heroic realism, the widening of the shoulders and making these people like bigger, and kind of the composition, being able to show them like towering over you, is a very common theme. So I can't show a presentation about propaganda without talking about the German side of the war of World War II. So this is an example of like the Red Cross, but what I'd like you to notice in this poster is the utilization of the Black Gothic typography. Now we hadn't seen this, we saw this mostly in like illuminated manuscripts and early printing in the Renaissance. So when Gutenberg first invents or mechanizes printing, he references the Gothic lettering of the medieval manuscripts. And what happens in Germany is that Hitler declares this as a national typeface. He is basically outlawing sans serif typography. Now, I do have an example here that does include sans serif, but he wanted a national identity, and that included showing this typographic symbolism of German. You'll also see similar types of heroic realism and Christian iconography with the light above his head, showing him as the premier leader. And notice how even though that this is an illustration, not a photograph, but the representation of the people in the background, even it just like looks like a huge crowd. And on this example, this is actually being used in a photograph to like manipulate the crowd scenery and put him in the center as this like the leader, right? And you'll notice the use of the Gothic typeface. Here's one more example of the Gothic typeface. And if you recall in the previous presentation about Art Nouveau, we learned the word Jugend is youth. Jugendstil was youth style. So this is Hitler Youth. Okay, and another one where you have the trains and the symbolism and the logos that are being used within that community and that movement. Okay. Now, Nazi propaganda is something that could be its own, you know, deep dive as examples of numerous museums about this, but I'm going to go ahead and just kind of show you this website so that you can kind of visit this on your own. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is the one that I'm using as an example, but I encourage you to look at others. And this goes into a lot of information and is going to have the collections of artifacts, photos, personal stories, films, as well as some of the posters that you might expect. Okay, so the use of propaganda in the war is something that's very important in terms of understanding this as a societal thing that happened, right? Propaganda is a dissemination of information to influence or control large groups of people, right? We talked about it being positive or negative. In totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany, propaganda plays a significant role in consolidating power in the hands of the controlling party. Nearly all aspects of German culture were subjected to the propaganda ministry control, including films, theater, music, the press, radio broadcasts. Given tremendous leeway by Hitler and utilizing modern techniques and technologies, set out an ambitious agenda to indoctrinate German people in the ideology and to influence the behavior of the entire society. Okay, so I would encourage you to dig a little bit deeper into that. Now let's switch gears a little bit to something post-World War, or kind of like around 1937 is pre-World War, but something that is a little bit more positive for society, since that is like a heavy, World War II is very heavy, and war propaganda is something very complex and also very heavy on us as we become more aware. Now, the Rural Electrification Administration is another one of those organizations in the US that we can look to that is the top down. So the beginning of this presentation, I talked about the COVID and how that was artists and illustrators kind of and designers coming together and creating these campaigns. This was the rural electrification was actually a government thing, and it's in order to help spread awareness about the things that were happening in a rural area. Now we're going to talk about Lester Beale, who is the designer for these. Lester Beale was not he didn't go to school for design. Here is his name right here, Beale. So again, like 1960s, you can often find the person who designed these. Let's learn a little bit more about the Rural Electrification Administration. It was actually an act passed in 1936 by Congress, and it's part of the New Deal. And it allowed federal government to make low-cost loans to farmers to create nonprofit cooperatives to bring electricity to rural America. You can still see these co-ops today. Not all areas are, tied to kind of like an electric utility company. Some of them are still managed by these rural co-ops. So these congressional acts were created for the same purpose. The Homestead Act was to elevate the condition of men to lift artificial weights all shoulders. 1930s, the senator from Nebraska was concerned about the descendants of homesteaders and other people living in rural America were not getting a fair chance. So basically the Rural Electrification Administration was bringing running water and electricity to rural communities. And they hired Lester Beale to do these posters. So here's an example of the Public Works collection at the Library of Congress, which is also the WPA, so the Parks Administration, which was another aspect of the New Deal. So this was really important because what they were trying to do as like coming out of the Depression was to how to put people to work. So the New Deal is actually helping Americans um, get jobs and have work. And some of those people were the artists and the designers of the time to work with the posters. So you can see, you're going to see some examples of like the parks, national parks, as well as the things that Lester Beale does. This is a collection at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Some of these images aren't available. I don't know why, but they're easy to find, and I have some examples here. Okay, so I'm going to click back over, and we're going to look at some of Lester Beale's posters. Now, again, if we were partnering up with someone sitting next to us, if we were sitting in a classroom, I would ask you to look at these images and see what you notice. Okay, so if you want to pause, this would be a good time to do it, just to take a look at some of the, compare these examples. Okay, so let me point some things out if you haven't already noticed them yourself. So the use of photographs, but they're cutting out the shapes. This is very common for us today, right? We can cut things out and make montages with things. We can insert a background. You have the use of lines. You have the use of red, white, and blue for very patriotic, right? This is a kind of like an abstracted version of a flag, very patriotism. And here we see a lot of geometric shapes with the circles repeating. So the Electrification Administration is trying to communicate to a rural environment of why electricity is important for them. So you have like, cooking, for example. Here, he's using very simple shapes and symbols to help explain that they would provide running water or electricity for lights. These are a little bit contrasting in what you see commonly with Lester Beale with red, white, and blue, but he is, kind of dividing the space up in a similar way and just using the flatness of shapes. This example shows how he uses arrows a lot, right? So we're getting radios and air towers for important communication. Later on in his career, Lester Beale worked for the United States Housing Authority, and you can see that technology starts to change, and as he grows as a designer and a visual communicator, how he's utilizing some of his similar ways of composition with the flatness, but here he's using like a photo montage, like we would do this in Adobe Illustrator, for example, and make a clipping mask. So this was done in like a darkroom, for example, and having to cut out the photographs. And his use of color is very common as well over his career. So you can look up Lester Beale from the MoMA, the Library of Congress, and then there are some other articles and websites that have information about him. Okay, so we're almost finished with this presentation. I would like to just add on that there's a lot of international examples that are not covered in depth here, but you can see the evolution of the Russian constructivism and this idea of new typography. So oftentimes in the Russian examples, you're going to see large scale, primarily of like people or machines and technology, photographs. Obviously the written language is going to be Cyrillic and Russian. Here you're seeing planes being used as just simple shapes and more of an airbrush technique. And this is photographic, right? Photographs. Here's another example of Soviet political and propaganda, right? Of like industrial working in the factories and helping. This is industrial worker against the fascist threat. The dynamic angles and painterly treatment of the large constructivist figure combined to make it a particularly strong poster. So the archive of some of these Russian examples are found on this website. I don't know if they still have these examples that I screenshotted a few years ago, but I just want to show you some resources for that. So this is Barbara Leibowitz graphics, and there's a really nice directory of a lot of posters from Art Nouveau, Art Deco, Avant-Garde, and down here you've got even opera, right? So opera, this is an Art Deco time period where the composition is mostly typography grounded in the bottom, and then the shooting very tall figure that we learned about last week. There's some Russian posters, like movie posters, Spanish Civil War. Okay, so there's a good variety here. In addition, they have Chinese propaganda posters, which I think are really interesting, and as far as like the way that illustrations and paintings are being used in these. This website is the Chinese public health posters from the National Library of Medicine. So these are some really interesting comparisons to some of the examples that I showed at the beginning of this presentation. So in 2006, the National Library of Medicine acquired a Chinese public health collection, over 7,000 items. So we've got like communicable diseases, similar to what we looked at the beginning of the presentation, like malaria. Okay, so like things that are being spread, hygiene, like comparing like the bathing to this one as like bathing and cleaning. The war, so you can see some examples of Chinese propaganda from that perspective. Here's examples of like vaccines. Okay, then we've got, let's see, you can also shop. So this example is from, I think, Soviet health posters for socialist medicine, and lots of really interesting, just deep dive into all of these. And the irony now is that these were intended to be, you know, public awareness propaganda pieces, and now in today's society they're being sold as art, right? This one is an AIDS poster, and it's being sold for 250 euros to put on your wall, right? So there's some irony in looking at these vintage posters, and this is an example of Etsy selling vintage public health posters. But in and of themselves, they're really great visual examples. This one is an amalgamation of imagery from the Black Plague, of this mask that would have been used, that was being used kind of in conjunction with like washing your hands and not spreading diseases that are kind of plague related. I'll show a few more slides before we close out. So again, some Chinese propaganda to prevent heavenly flowers, vaccinate at once. We can understand the rhetoric devices in there. And again, when you're looking at any of these, it's really important to look at who is the messenger. So this is the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. So eradicating polio at a certain time. And then as time progresses, we start to see the style and the use of illustrations and photography change. So these examples are, you know, public health awareness, trying to get people to understand what an X-ray is, for example, and kind of getting their own healthcare in their hands to find out and make sure that they're not acquiring this disease or spreading the disease. So coughs and sneezes spread diseases. And here's some examples of public health awareness utilizing information design, which is the next presentation that I will have for you. So this information design where you have simple symbols to represent a certain, you know, amount of people, or symbolic rather than photographic. But here, what they're doing is using the substitution or the erasing. So, right, so you have a photograph of like an empty space, empty space, empty space. So early techniques of using photography that are a little bit different than the ones that we were looking at here with like a Photoshop thing, or with this one where you're manipulating like what's included in the sign or how big the crowd is. So this one a little bit longer than I normally have been spending my time, but I appreciate your time, and hopefully you were able to learn a little bit more about the subject of propaganda. Okay, thank you.